Good morning. My name is Victoria Bavard. I'm a Coolidge senator from the class of 2016 and a graduate of Duke University. I currently work in Dallas for the Boston Consulting Group. We will now move to session 2. The title of this session is The 1960s to the Financial Crisis of 2008, Wrong Turns and Corrections. The moderator of this session is James Freeman, assistant editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page and author of the weekday Best of the Web column. Mr. Freeman is the author of Borrowed Time, 2 Centuries of Booms, Busts, and Bailouts at Citi. Please welcome James Freeman and our esteemed panelists to the stage.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Thanks to Amity and Bill and the Coolidge Foundation for including me in this great event. It's great to see my old boss, Chris Cox, here. He was at least when I worked there, he was the gold standard among Capitol Hill employers, which, as he knows, is sort of tallest building in Topeka praise, but he would be the gold standard in any workplace. So great honor to be here with him and this distinguished group. It's a privilege to be part of this excellent and much needed event. And I say much needed because there's a bizarre phenomenon in this city in which the larger the federal debt pile grows, the less politicians seem to regard it as a problem.
That's true.
Whereas there used to be a debate, and when, for example, when Chris was in Congress, competing plans on how we deal with this rising debt. Now it's almost complete silence. It's a very awkward silence, as if they think if they ignore it, maybe it'll go away. Of course, it won't. To take just one random example of this phenomenon I'm describing, 40 years ago, a senator from Delaware demanded a vote on a federal spending freeze as the condition of him agreeing to raise the debt limit, which at that time was about $1.5 trillion. Even adjusting for inflation, a fraction of what the debt burden is today. 18 years ago, that same senator from Delaware was warning about a tsunami of debt and again saying he would not vote to increase the debt limit. Now, by coincidence, I'm told that that same distinguished gentleman from Delaware will actually be speaking here on Capitol Hill tonight. And my sources tell me that he is unlikely to endorse a federal spending freeze tonight. I think it's probably a reasonable expectation that he's going to say nothing at all about this problem. But fortunately, with impeccable timing, the Coolidge Foundation, the Coolidge Scholars, and other stalwart defenders of the Hamiltonian norm are here on Capitol Hill to revive public debate with a healthy dose of good sense and appreciation for our great history. Now, many of you know our panelists here, so I won't go through their full impressive biographies. Those are available for those of you who don't. I would just like to give a brief introduction so that we can hear their remarks and take your questions. They're each going to speak for 7 minutes, and then we'll get into the questions. Our first speaker, Chris DeMuth, for 2 decades led the American Enterprise Institute and built it into an intellectual powerhouse among Washington think tanks. He is now the Distinguished Fellow in American Thought at the Heritage Foundation, and he is perhaps the nation's preeminent chronicler of America's descent into fiscal madness. I should say the American government's descent. But he's here to tell us how this awful burden, which the scholars especially will have to deal with all through their lives, unfortunately, came to be. And here to give us the gory details, please welcome Chris DeMuth.
Thank you, Jim. The Hamilton norm discussed at the previous session is a norm of monetary policy. Manage federal debt to sustain a trustworthy credit record and stable national currency. There is a complementary norm of fiscal policy, the balanced budget norm. It goes like this. Fund regular government operations with current revenues from taxes and tariffs. Borrow only for investments and response to emergencies, wars, natural disasters, severe economic downturns. 3, reduce accumulated debts over time through budget surpluses and economic growth. The two norms are complementary because borrowing for public investments and crisis response is, in theory, not always in practice, but in theory, financially sound and politically legitimate. And these recurring needs generate enough borrowing to support continuous participation in credit markets and a debt-secured currency. The balanced budget norm was a matter of bipartisan consensus, as we have heard, and followed with fair consistency for most of American history from 1789 through the 1960s. In the last 50 years, we have abandoned both norms for a new set of norms: massive spending on welfare and entitlement benefits, continuous deficits, staggering accumulated debt, monetary instability, and recurring financial crises. A prominent student of this transformation, Nobel economics laureate James Buchanan, thought it was caused by a loss of moral responsibility on the part of both leaders and citizens. But if we examine the 1960s and 1970s, the decades of transition from the old norms to the new, we can see two more particular causes at work. The first was intellectual, fine-tuning the economy, which arrived at the White House in 1963. John Maynard Keynes, writing during the Depression, had subscribed to the balanced budget norm. He advocated budget deficits during depressions, balanced by budget surpluses when the economy recovered. But his sophisticated rationalization of an established practice inspired his academic apostles to go further in the 1950s. If government budgets, could help get us through a depression, why not use them to manage the economy's lesser ups and downs in normal times? Taxing and spending should be set not to balance each other, but instead to balance the entire economy by responding to fluctuations in inflation, unemployment, productive capacity, and other statistical measures. A leading proponent of fine-tuning, Walter Heller of the University of Minnesota, was appointed chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors by President Kennedy in 1961. During JFK's first 2 years in office, the economy was growing well, but the budget was in deficit. Heller thought the economy could do even better if federal taxes were reduced, even if that enlarged the deficit. Kennedy was an old-fashioned budget balancer and wanted to continue whittling away at the World War II debt as Ike had done. But Heller was persistent, and he was the sort of brilliant, confident intellectual that JFK admired. The president eventually went along, proposing his epical tax cut in early 1963. It was enacted a year later under President Johnson following Kennedy's assassination. The federal budget, which had varied between deficits and surpluses since World War II, turned then to regular deficits. But at first, the deficits were small, and total debt continued to fall as a share of the growing national economy, and some aspects of the Kennedy tax cuts contributed to that growth. At the same time, inflation began to explode. It was 1% about in 1961 and had tripled by 1966 to about 3%, and then it doubled again by the end of the decade to 6%. As far as the deficit is concerned, things changed when the deficit swelled to more than 14% of spending for the first time since World War II in 1968. LBJ's guns and butter policy meant large spending increases for the Vietnam War and an array of domestic initiatives: the war on poverty, the Great Society, new Social Security benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, with no new taxes to pay for them. Walter Heller, true to his creed, resigned and went back to the academy. But a Rubicon had been passed. The idea had taken hold among practicing politicians that federal spending should be determined not by revenues at hand, but by aspirations for an imagined future. The second cause was political. borrowing to fund welfare and entitlement payments to individuals, which arrived the next decade in the 1970s. When Richard Nixon took office in 1969, he began winding down spending on the Vietnam War and LBJ's Great Society programs. The budget turned to a surplus that year, and the Budget Bureau projected peace and growth dividends for many years to come. When President Nixon proposed his own welfare expansion in 1969, the Family Assistance Plan, he and everyone else assumed it would be funded by current, indeed surplus, tax revenues. But it was not to be. By August, the projected future surpluses were starting to look like deficits. Nixon's top domestic aide, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, briefing the press at the Western White House on the Pacific Coast, said that the peace dividend tends to become evanescent, like the morning clouds. What was happening was that the 1960s Social Security sweeteners, plus Medicare and Medicaid, were expanding automatic entitlement spending faster than anyone had expected. Beginning in 1970, big deficit spending became the new normal in years of peace and prosperity and of war and depression. Richard Nixon and his economists were not fine-tuners, but they came up with their own ways to rationalize deficits. Their full employment budget was a budget that was in deficit, but that would be balanced if more people were working and paying taxes rather than drawing benefits. But the numbers soon outpaced the euphemisms. Deficits averaged 10% of federal spending in the 1970s and grew to 18% in the 1980s, since the COVID lockdown year of 2000, when the government borrowed nearly half of what it spent. Deficits have been settling down to a regular 20 to 25% of spending. My co-panelists are going to tell us how we got from there to here, but I want to conclude with 2 points. First, although there have been other steps along the way, such as President Nixon's taking the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, the growth of welfare and entitlement spending has been critical. Benefits to individuals were 35% of federal spending in 1970. They soared past 50% in the mid-1970s and are more than 75% today and growing. However worthy the benefit programs, they are current consumption, which is fundamentally different from spending on investments or in response to war or crisis. They hold no prospect of expanding the future, but are simply borrowing from the future and have become a politically irresistible force for tax-exempt spending growth. Second, James Buchanan was right to worry about the morality of persistent deficit spending. President Coolidge once said that a good budget is among the noblest monuments of virtue. That is because budgeting obliges one to make choices among the long list of projects always competing for resources. It provides a politic way of saying no to brainstorms that one really opposes on the merits. It ferrets out waste and corruption. It limits the chances that well-intentioned interventions will do more harm than good. Today, massive borrowing has weakened all of these practices. Indeed, political advocacy often proceeds on the assumption that if a government initiative is worthy, it is therefore cost-free. President Biden says that his multi-billion-dollar Inflation Reduction Act has no costs, zero, only benefits. Republican advocates of multi-billion-dollar support for Ukraine say approximately the same thing, because, don't you know, we're not actually sending money to Ukraine. We're only sending them weapons and materiel produced in the United States, which is providing jobs to workers and revenue for businesses. This sort of argumentation denies the deepest truth of economics, that of opportunity cost. Every human action necessarily means not doing something else. A return to the balanced budget norm would, among other virtuous things, bring us back face to face with the reality of human choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Now we're going to move from fiscal madness to monetary madness. Our next guest is not mad, but I was just thinking it is perhaps a coincidence that when the distinguished gentleman from Delaware was calling for a spending freeze, that was right around the time Grant's Interest Rate Observer was launching in 1984. The 40th anniversary. Now, for those of you who go into finance, you will probably begin reading this all the time. It's been a must-read on Wall Street for a long time, and going back to when it first launched, as Jim, you probably know, for the younger folks in the audience, the junior staff at a Wall Street bond trading desk would stand around a device called a fax machine, and the weekly grants would come out slowly out of the machine. Then the junior employee would take it off the fax machine and sprint, not walk, to the senior people on the bond desk to allow them to read the latest. So we have, fortunately, the perfect guest to talk about the monetary excesses that led us to this point. Please join me in welcoming Jim Grant.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, James. This 1960s, when one of the transition phase between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, between, shall we say, George Washington and Donald J. Trump, when all this was happening, the 60s began actually in 1957, which, to anchor that year, was the year the Brooklyn Dodgers began their move to Los Angeles. Sad time for some of us. But in 1957 and 58, Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia convened hearings, and he called it the investigation of the financial condition of the United States. It was the most detailed deep dive into American finance since the Aldrich hearings Dr. Bruner mentioned. And so what prompted this? In 1907, of course, it was a panic that led to the investigation of American money and American fiscal affairs. But in 1957, what was it? There was no obvious provocation. The rather nuanced provocation was an inflation rate on the order of 3.5%, and a public debt that fully rose to 55% of GDP, and an untidy rise in all manner of private debts. And Harry Byrd was concerned. Indeed, I suppose that as a Democrat, he was especially concerned because Dwight D. Eisenhower, a Republican, was president. But here is the way he framed it. The immediate occasion for this study, said Byrd when kicking off the proceedings, is the existing credit and interest situation, and more important, inflation, which has started, again with its ominous threat to fiscal solvency, sound money, and individual welfare. Now, the reason why these hearings are interesting and indeed constitute a milestone in thought in this country about finance is the collective attitude towards what we would today call the most impossible, backward-looking, retrograde, lost-backed set of convictions that got us into the terrible difficulties of the 1930s. Those were the orthodoxies still prevailing in the 50s. But interestingly, the attitudes that shone through in these hearings were these. It was something went wrong in 1932, and that something was not the Depression. It was rather the elision of American public finance from pay-as-you-go to chronic indebtedness. Ben S. Bernanke, PhD, the former Fed chairman, had a positive antipathy towards the thing he called deflation, which some of us recognized as the Walmart business model of everyday low and lower prices. But Dr. Bernanke could not abide the idea that prices would actually dwindle rather than rise in an orderly, regimented fashion. And what is so interesting about the hearings and the testimony was everyone kind of bought into the Walmart approach. They, in their ignorance and innocence, thought that it would be better to spend less rather than more. This has taken the name lately of deflation. But before leaving the prelude to the fugue of the 1960s, I want to share with you some of the testimony by the then Fed chairman, a gentleman named William McChesney Martin. He'd been Fed chairman since 1951. And he was hauled up for a merciless grilling by the senators because the inflation rate had climbed to 3% plus. It had been negative as recently as 1955. A few months in 1955, CPI showed year-over-year declines, a state of affairs which today would trigger not a congressional investigation, but a national 911 call to get to the bottom of this absence, this chronic absence of inflation. But somebody asked Chairman Martin testifying. They asked question came, Chairman Martin, a prior witness had said that he regretted deeply America's move off of a convertible currency, the gold standard. What do you think? And Chairman Martin said the following, quote, "I think it would have been well if we could have stayed on the gold standard." And to the query, is there any valid principle to justify creation by the government of currency against government debt? The chairman of the Federal Reserve answered, "Nope, I don't think so." Okay, so that was then. That was 1957-58. And in the remaining hour of my remarks, I want to tell you about how the timeline worked between that expression of orthodoxy and the final inflationary result of the late 1960s. And it came upon us like little cat's feet in a fog. So so to go back to the 50s for a moment. 1953, the United States uncharacteristically registered a trade deficit. Now recall that under the Bretton Woods system, the dollar was fixed to $35 to the ounce of gold. And supposedly, a sovereign holder of dollar bills could trade those in for the Treasury for an ounce of gold from Fort Knox. That was a theory. But in reality, the sovereigns did not so request. They were under the protection of American military and naval forces in Europe, indeed throughout the world, and they didn't want to rock the Cold War boat. But look at what happened gradually and by degree in the 1960s, leading us up to the 70s, the notorious, badly dressed 1970s. 1960, the gold price, then fixed at $35, without permission from the authorities, trades at $40 and change in Europe. Gold was not traded in this country. Indeed, one could not lawfully own gold in this country, nor, thanks to an executive order signed by Dwight Eisenhower, could one own gold abroad. It was verboten. It was positively outlawed. But gold poked higher, suggesting that the American dollar was not all it seemed. In the context, by the way, of an inflation rate between the years 1960 and 64 never got above 2%, and indeed was at levels that this Fed would regard as unsatisfactory in the absence of inflation. So gradually and by degree, people became nervous about the stability of Bretton Woods and about the virtues and the stability of the United States dollar. And the gold price crept higher. How did the American react to this? Did it, as was expected to do, tighten credit conditions, raise rates? No, it did not do anything of this kind. What it did is institute a gold pool to manipulate the price of gold lower in Europe. In 1964 was enacted the interest equalization tax. There was an Operation Twist, which tried to manipulate the yield curve. This was in the more or less orthodox early 1960s. Finally, the giveaway to what was happening was the gradual disappearance of silver coin. 1960, 61, 62, the mint got in so much silver, it sent it back into circulation, less and less was coming in. A friend of mine, the late, great Bill Rickenbacker, wrote a book called Wooden Nickels. Wooden Nickels. You must read it. And it was a story of this early warning on a looming inflation that had not yet registered. Bill, where's our compiler of the CPI, had not registered in the government data, but the world had been kind of like snakes in the ground, feeling a tremble of an earthquake coming. The market sensed that the dollar's stability, that the sanctity of the promise to redeem the dollar, all that was ending. And very soon, indeed, it did. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for that sobering history. We now turn to David Stockman, who was elected to Congress in 1976 from Michigan, and then in 1981 joined the Reagan administration as budget director, one of the architects of the Reagan economic program, but he soon took on the role of trying to stand athwart deficits, yelling "stop." He eventually moved on to a very successful career in investing. You went from public losses to private equity, which
same thing
seems maybe a good trade there. But anyway, here to tell us how that worked out after the deficit arguments of the early 1980s. Please welcome David Stockman.
Well, thank you. I'm a little uncomfortable sitting here on the left wing of this panel, but I take relief from the fact that I'm flanked on the very far left by Phil Gramm. I feel pretty good. Actually, I'm supposed to start in 1970, and that year is near and dear to me, and this location physically is as well. Because in 1970, I came to Washington as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed young guy. I had studied all my Hamilton. I'd studied all my Coolidge. I came down to Washington to work as a staffer on Capitol Hill, and the first thing I did was to look up the national debt and see where we were. And it was $350 billion. And the second thing I did was to look for a place to live. And I stumbled on, believe it or not, a place on the street on the other side of this curtain that was a wonderful little apartment. It was dirt cheap, the rent. I couldn't believe it. Here I was a newbie in town, and I found this wonderful bargain, and my friends couldn't believe it. And for the next 2 years, I was always covered with dust and grit and sand. And I soon learned the rent was so cheap because my street and apartment were uninhabitable, because across the street they were building the largest library in the world. This one right here. And the reason I mention this anecdote is that was 1970, and they went on to build great monumental buildings in the tens and the hundreds and even the thousands throughout Washington. And we end up today with the most prosperous capital city in the world. But we also end up, and maybe that's a good thing, but we also end up with a debt, not $350 billion, but $34.5 trillion, which even if you're doing math in your head is 100x. It's 100 times growth in that roughly half-century period. At the same time, now you can say, well, yeah, but there's been a lot of growth, there's been a lot of inflation, sure. But if you take the nominal GDP, which is the metric, that's what's, you got to support this thing with, the national economy, it is up by 25x, from a little $1.1 trillion to 26, 27. So if you're in a situation, not for a couple years, or not during some crisis or even a war, but a half a century, in which the public debt is growing 4 times faster than the national income, you've got an equation that doesn't compute, that isn't sustainable, and you have, more importantly, and this is what we should talk about, a fiscal governance process that is totally malfunctioned and broke down. And I've been given 4 more minutes to explain how that happened, how we went 100x on the debt, how our fiscal process ended up in shambles in that period of time. And I tried to boil it down into 4 words: war, welfare, wishful thinking, and wampum. And wampum is the easy money in the central bank that Jim talks about. War is a warfare state that today costs us, if you really calculate it correctly, $1.3 trillion. That's the DOD, that's so-called Function 150, International Affairs, Security Assistance, the CIA running around the world, all the other democracy-promoting things we're doing, foreign aid, giveaways, etc., and veterans, because veterans are the deferred costs of all these forever wars that we didn't really need, but you end up with humans that have, disabilities, both of mind and body, that the government needs to support. You put all that together, it's 1.3 trillion. When I came in 1970, it was 1.3 trillion, it was 89 billion. So the warfare state is huge expansion. Even if you take the inflation out of it, it is 2.5 times bigger today than it was in 1970, even though in 1970 we were at the peak of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was still standing on its own 2 feet. There were 50,000 tanks on the Central Front in Poland and so forth. There were several thousand nuclear warheads pointed at us. It was tense. Today, the Cold War ended. Soviet Union disappeared. There's the rump left there. Russia, 2 trillion of GDP. Ours is 27 trillion. NATO's is 45 trillion. So we don't have any kind of enemy in the world like we had then. There's China. China would last about 6 months. It's a Ponzi scheme, one of the greatest Ponzi schemes in history. It would last 6 months if the 3.5 trillion of exports that go to the U.S. and Europe were suddenly interrupted because they decided to invade California. So the point is, we've got half the threat in the world today, or less, than we had in 1970. And we have 2.5 times more warfare state. That's the problem number one. Secondly, if you look at the welfare state, and that's the second piece of this, in 1970, the total transfer payments for everything from Social Security down to food stamps and the new programs, Medicaid and so forth, that had come from the Great Society, were 71 billion. Today, it's 4 trillion. Okay, so that's up 56 times, and even if you take the inflation out of that number, it's still up 10 times. It's gone from 6% of GDP to 15% of GDP. So what I'm saying here is that over that 50-year period, we didn't get rid of the warfare state. In fact, it got much bigger, even though the reason for it more or less disappeared. We got a huge increase in the welfare state, and then 2 other things happened that make the problem so intractable today. Number one, we decided that we would have Calvin Coolidge level of taxation, but present-day levels of warfare state and welfare state. And let's just look at how good Coolidge was and how he accomplished it. Everybody heard it, but let me give you a couple numbers which defy current reality. GDP growth during his period was 4% a year. Inflation was 0.0% a year. Per capita real growth, which is really the standard of living of Main Street, Middle America, went up 2.5% a year. There's no better combination of those fundamental metrics anywhere before or after, or even prospectively going forward. But why was in that period, why was Coolidge and Harding before him able to cut spending by 40 to 50%, take those wartime taxes way down, and reduce the national debt from 26 trillion to, I think, about 26 billion to 16 during that period? The answer is there was no warfare state. We totally demobilized after World War I. The doughboys came home, and we basically said, we got the Atlantic moat, we got the Pacific moat, we can protect our shoreline. We didn't need to worry about the airspace yet, and we didn't need to get involved in, it was a mistake to be in World War I. Everybody knew that in the 20s, and so we dismantled our warfare state. Second, we didn't have a welfare state. Franklin Roosevelt was still kicking around the governor's mansion in Albany. So we didn't have a welfare state. So it was possible on 7% of GDP to shrink the spending, because it was mostly military spending, to shrink the taxes, which were mostly war taxes, to balance the budget, to have great prosperity, and to live happily ever after. I mention all of this because what we're in today is the opposite of that wonderful combination or confluence. A warfare state that the two parties in Washington keep, insisting on funding and involving ourselves in the, the Red Sea, sea lane traffic, and stumbling around in Ukraine. I'm not supposed to go into all this war stuff, but I will, because the fact is, this great enemy, which is a tiny fraction of us, Russia, is unable to even conquer the Donbass, which is a Russian-speaking 400 or 500-year Russian territory that happened to be in Ukraine because Lenin put it there. So we have a situation today where Putin's trying to cancel what Lenin did, is having a hard time doing it, and the people in Washington say, no, you can't do that. We're going to send hundreds of billions of dollars there and involve ourselves in one more forever war that we don't need. So when you look at that, and when you look at what happened to the welfare state, you can understand why we are where we are. Most of the groundwork for that happened in the 1980s. I'll mention four things that happened during my tenure at OMB. One, we said, Ronald Reagan ran on the platform that we're going to cut taxes deeply, we're going to rebuild our national defense, we're going to balance the budget by 1984. That was a pretty hard equation to put together. But in order to do that, we had to present a 5-year plan within weeks of taking office, and nobody knew what the defense buildup was going to look like. So on one night for 15 minutes on January 30, 1981, I went over to the Pentagon, and my plan, which was the campaign plan, was to start with the Carter budget of 140 billion from 1980, increase it by 5% in real terms a year, which is what the pledge was during the campaign. That would have taken the budget 5 years out, the defense budget, to 200. Got to the Pentagon, and they were saying, oh no, we're going to start in 2021 with all the big increases that had been put through that year in supplementals because of all the crisis with the Iranian hostages and so forth. We're going to start with 220, and we're going to do 7%, not 5%. Well, when you do the math, that took you to 300 billion. So the first point was the defense budget ended up 75% bigger, or the increase, than what the campaign had been based on. The second thing we had to do then was present a balanced budget to Congress in February. Well, with defense, with those kinds of numbers, it was impossible. So I cooked up this thing called the magic asterisk, which was 44 billion of savings to be presented later. It turned out, but I actually had a plan. Everybody criticized me. I had a plan, and the plan was in phase 2, very quickly, we were going to get to big entitlement reform. Social Security, Medicare, and even more sweeping changes in federal retirements and so forth. That was presented to Congress. We cooked it up very quickly. It was a big plan, some really important and solid and justifiable changes. I won't go into all of them. It went up to the Senate. They looked at it for 2 days and voted 96-0 against it. And if Phil Gramm had been there, then it might have been 95-1. But it became, and this is the important part about it, that event in May 1981 became the third rail of American politics. No one has been able to seriously deal with entitlement reform since then, after that tremendous reaction. Third thing that happened was we got ultra-low taxes that we didn't intend. Back in those days, the Republican elders were actually very concerned about deficit-financed tax cuts. They were concerned that we had a Fed run by Paul Volcker who wasn't about ready to print the money, monetize the debt if the deficit broke out. And so they had to be persuaded and begged to cut taxes. Can you imagine that? Politicians nowadays, they'll do it at the drop of a hat. So when we got into the battle to enact the Reagan tax cut, The only way we were able to get the votes we needed, the majority in the House and Senate, was to bribe senators and congressmen with all kinds of loopholes and all kinds of special tax breaks and benefits for their constituencies. The long and short of it was the tax cut that Reagan proposed across the board, supply-side tax cut that cost 4% of GDP. This thing, when it finally got, we called it the bidding war. When the bidding war got done, it cost 6% of GDP. Now, so think about this. The defense budget was 75% bigger than intended. The tax cut was 50% larger than intended. The deficit broke way open to 40, it was huge. It was going to be somewhere in the range of 5% of GDP, 23% spending. We got taxes all the way down to 16% of GDP on the revenue side. It wasn't going to last. So I did the only thing a green eye shade could do. I spent like 2 years trying to persuade and bamboozle the Gipper, President Reagan, into raising taxes. And he was dead set against it. But over that 3-year period, 82, 83, and 84, we were able to claw back 45% of the tax cut that got way out of hand, the bidding war, because otherwise we would have had instantaneous, massive fiscal disorder. Now, that kind of solved the problem a little bit, but it didn't, because it then basically turned those of us who felt that was unavoidable into a Judas. We became the traders. We became, the traders of supply side. We were run out of town on a rail. And from then on, Republicans couldn't talk about revenue as part of the budget mix, because you know what happens to people who are, I was, charged with being a tax grabber, which is, I guess, a pretty bad thing, or the tax collector for the welfare state. So the reason I'm going through the 80s then is that what has happened to our politics is Republicans can't talk about taxes. In fact, they're so vociferous on it that the Democrats treat it now as their third rail. The Democrats always used to be for more taxes, more revenue. That's how we fund it. Not anymore. They're afraid to death they'll get attacked in the campaign for being tax raisers. Republicans are afraid to even mention the word out loud as Social Security. I mean, Trump's got the nomination. He's saying no Social Security cuts, no Medicare cuts. We're going to, well, what the hell? Okay, so the Democrats have turned that into the third rail. Nobody talks about entitlements. And both parties are in what I call the uniparty, the war party, when it comes to the warfare state. So when that is the state of our politics, the problem isn't process. It's not that, we could change the budget process some way or amend the Budget Act. The problem is policy in politics.
Okay.
And until somehow we can unwind that, we're going to be stuck with debts that are heading to the stratosphere.
Okay, David, thank you. A lot to think about there. And now for perhaps another view on the 1980s and also some thoughts on the years since then. We're very fortunate to have a former economics professor, Phil Gramm, here. He was in the U.S. Congress, the U.S. House, I should say, for 6 years, and then 18 years in the U.S. Senate representing Texas, where he not only displayed that rare quality among politicians, a desire to cut federal spending, but even more rare, he actually had a great deal of success in this regard as the author of the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings plan in the 1980s. Please welcome Phil Gramm.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me begin by pointing out that this budget that David was talking about ended a 9-year period of 9.2% inflation. By 1984, the inflation's back was broken. The economy was growing at 4% a year, and politically it was morning in America. And so I want to tell sort of how I got involved in that battle and what I saw and what I think the lesson is. My involvement in the budget debate and in the debt debate started one morning in the mid-1970s when I woke up and realized that I was an adult. I had been promoted to a full professorship the day before. I went to bed thinking, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And so I woke up and I just didn't like what was happening in America. We were talking about the joyride was over, there would never be any more oil and gas. And of course, I knew that wasn't true. And the inflation rate had reached a gallop in that 9-year period where it averaged 9.2%. So I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal on energy and the energy crisis. And I had written 2 books, and I'd written 17 academic articles, and so far as I'm aware, nobody ever read them. I got over 100 first-class letters on that little article in the Wall Street Journal. And I thought, Jesus, this is incredible. And so I started speaking out on issues. And then I decided to run for public office. My problem was I didn't know many people, and the people I knew didn't like me. But there was a crisis in the 1970s. People were frightened as to what was happening. And so I won by 122 votes. All of my opponents, there was no general election, it was just a primary, made the pledge election night they were going to run again. I came to Washington, and I was on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and the first day on that committee, we were debating pipeline safety. Being from Texas, needless to say, I was involved. And I spoke, and David Stockman spoke on the other side of the aisle. And I immediately figured out that there was a light on inside his head. And so when the hearing was over, I got up and went over to try to grab him before he got out of the room. He got up to come over to introduce himself to me, and so we met right behind John Dingell. And that formed an alliance. And we, in 1980, we did hospital cost containment first, and were successful. We wrote a budget in 1980, and it was called a bipartisan budget on my side of the aisle. David wasn't on the budget committee, right?
No.
And so we had as the co-sponsor, what was her name again? Yeah, Marjorie Holt.
Yeah.
And so anyway, she had nothing to do with it. And so anyway, that was the beginning of our political alliance. And we offered the budget. I think it got 159 votes. But the important thing is it got over 30 Democrat votes. And so we have the election of 1980. I guess I can sum up that election. Right before the election, I was on my way home, and I got to the Dallas airport where I had to change planes to go to College Station. And there were 8 TV cameras. And so the question was, who should people vote for president? Now, everybody knew that I was for Ronald Reagan. But I was a Democrat. I'd been elected as a Democrat. And so I just simply said, I'm not going to tell people how to vote, but if you love your country, you'll know what to do. And oh my God, the Democrats went crazy. But in any case, people knew what to do. And Reagan was elected, Stockman went to OMB, and our budget became the core of the Reagan budget. And so I became the House author of the Reagan program, along with Del Latta, who was a very sweet man who never trusted me and who was there. And so we had chaos because Jim Wright, who was majority leader, would not allow me to offer an amendment. So I had to turn over our budget to Del Latta. And unbeknown to me or to Stockman, Del Latta changed the budget and offered the budget without ever telling me, telling David, and therefore never telling the president. And so I get up the next morning, I go to the floor, it's the big day for the big debate, time limit debate. We're going to vote at the end of this day. And then I discover once he offers the budget and Democrats start attacking handwritten changes in the bill. And so anyway, it was, so I got Stockman on the phone. He came down. We set up this thing where they discovered the changes, they attacked them. Stockman put together material. I went out and put the fire out. And so we put out every fire they started. And it came down on the key vote to one vote. And the vote was a guy named Sam Hall from Marshall, Texas. And so in a very unusual action, the speaker gets up out of the chair. They've held over the vote past the time limit. And Sam Hall is standing there with his card. And so the speaker comes down, and I was talking to Sam. And so the speaker comes down, so I back away. And the speaker says, Sam, this is an embarrassment. The Republicans have done all this handwritten in the thing, and showed him this woman's telephone number that's written into the law. And so anyway, the speaker goes back up to the speaker's table. And so I say to Sam, this is not about, and so the speaker's argument was, for the sake of the House, vote no. And so I said, Sam, this is not about the House, it's about America. We can fix all this crap. We're going to take that telephone number out first thing comes. So anyway, Sam Hall, Democrat from Marshall, Texas, stuck his card in and voted aye. And the Berlin Wall came down. We broke the back of inflation. The economy boomed. But from that point on, I couldn't get anybody to be concerned about spending and about the deficit. And so I had observed, I want to be careful here I don't go over, but I had observed as a freshman congressman that the problem was all these special interest groups were looking over one shoulder and nobody was looking over the other shoulder. And so spending dominated. So I had this idea that if we could put a constraint on spending and the deficit, that we could force special interest groups to compete against each other, and that congressmen and senators could say, gosh, my heart goes out to your problem, and I know you're suffering. But if I do this terrible law is going to cut spending across the board, and I can't do it. So anyway, I offered Graham Rudman. The president called me down to the White House and said, Cap Weinberger says you're more dangerous than the Soviet Union. He said, tell me it's not true. And I said, Mr. President, it's not true. But I want to ask you a question. In your heart, do you think Moscow is more dangerous to the future of America than Washington, D.C.? President said, I better not answer that question. So in any case, let me conclude with one final point, and I think it's a very important point. When you look at this chart here on the debt, if I ask you how much of that debt was produced by Social Security, you would probably tell me significant amount. Not one penny of that debt has been produced by the Social Security program. The Social Security program has reduced the deficit almost consistently since its birth, and only since 2009 has it contributed anything to the deficit. Medicare. Well, Medicare does contribute to the deficit, but there's a Medicare tax. So the elephant in the room that is totally neglected in this debate is social welfare spending, means-tested welfare. When the war on poverty started in 1967, we were spending $9,700 per household in the bottom 20% of income earners in America for benefits to them. Today, in real purchasing power dollars, it's over $50,000 a year. Of course, the labor force participation rate has fallen from 67% to 36% among that group. That's the elephant in the room. Now, we need to reform Social Security because it's getting ready to make a claim on the debt. But it didn't cause that graph. That's important for us to understand. Do we have a problem that we can't solve? No. Are we taking steps to solve it today? No. The president here tonight is going to tell us that actually the inflation is caused by greed. He brought greed when he came to the Senate, and then we had that 9% inflation, and then we broke its back, and now he takes his hand off the Bible and greed comes back. So anyway, that's the story of how it happened. But the budget, this produced 25 years of American prosperity and a balanced budget under Bill Clinton. So we should start here and this time do the whole program. I think we're pretty much out of the picture, but somebody else. Thank you.
Chris was talking about this erosion over time in the morality of policymaking, the loss of a sense that it's immoral to run deficits, to pile debts on kids, grandkids, et cetera. As you think about, Senator, how this might be reformed and the pressures you saw, but in the 80s you were able to build a bipartisan coalition to put those constraints on. Do you think that's possible again? Is it just about a messenger, the right leadership in explaining it, or is there just no longer that sense that this is irresponsible to do to future Americans?
Well, first of all, I think the honest answer is I don't know, but I'll give you another answer. We made a dramatic change in 1980 because America made a dramatic change in 1980. We had a crisis. We had runaway inflation. We had 21.5% interest rate. Soviet Union was on the move all over the world. The embassy had been taken over in Iran, and people were scared. We eliminated 3 Social Security benefits in that reconciliation bill that passed by 1 vote. And we came right back and did the Social Security reform, which was not what I would have done, but on the other hand, it made Social Security solvent until 2009, in terms of actual taking in more than we spent. This trust fund, of course, is a government debt to itself. So the answer to your question in my mind is that it's not going to happen until there's a crisis. And crises bring forth new leadership. And they come from out of nowhere. And they're often there and you don't even know it. You know, John Adams said in 1774 that we were going to make the important decisions in the history of the world, and there wasn't leadership in America that was up to the task. Well, hell, he was surrounded by the greatest assemblage of leadership the world ever known. So it'll take a crisis. It'll take new leadership. The crisis will call forth the new leadership.
And Jim, do you have a sense of what that crisis would look like? I think the nature of these things in financial markets is that they come when they're not expected. But do you have in mind what it might look like? Is it Treasury attempts an auction and no one shows up to buy? What would happen if left unreformed?
You know, there was a failed Treasury auction, I think 1974 perhaps, and miraculously, the next day after the requisite number of bidders did not materialize, the subsequent auction was oversubscribed by some mysterious force on Liberty Street in New York City, which happens to be the address of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. You know, by definition, crises are unforeseen and seemingly inexplicable at the time. One could suggest some things. For example, we assumed that the dollar is the Coca-Cola of monetary brands, the category killer of worldwide money, and indeed there is a great deal of simple inertia with a reserve currency. People are very habitual in their currency preferences, but there could come a time in which there's just simply too many dollars in the world. The rate of interest is not sufficient to clear the market, and we would have, at that moment, by definition again, have lost the world's trust. Credit is an ineffable thing. You know, it's there and it's not there. And the United States is in a little bit of a way it was when John Adams was America's junk bond salesman in Holland during the Revolutionary War. You know, then the rating was actually speculative grade at the implied rating. Today it is, you know, split rated AA, AAA. But you know, they say you don't get an upgrade when you're a AAA. So definitionally, there's no way for America's perceived credit to go except down. And we are this great country, this great regenerative, inventive, seemingly indestructible enterprise we call the economy. That will be here come the day after the crisis, but it might just be that there are too many Treasury securities in the world, that the Fed is too much with us, that inflation will not obediently vanish, and that one day our interest rates will go up and the Fed will not be able to address it by bond buying because the rate of inflation will forestall its hand. Those are some possibilities of the lineaments of a possible future financial difficulty.
Yikes. I think we have a few minutes for some audience questions, if there's anyone who would like to. Yes, I think we have someone has a microphone who I think will be coming to you shortly. I'm sorry. Oh, got it. Okay.
So this one's for Senator Gramm. You mentioned the impact of special interest groups in political spending. So how would you recommend reforming that to drive down spending as a result of these special interest groups?
If I understand the question, how do you overcome special interest? Well, you have to you have to create, there has to be a countervailing political force where basically you explain to people that while this is a special interest that we're not going to provide their benefit, that the cost of that benefit is so great that you're doing a public service by not doing it. And when we passed our budget, we lost 30 seats in the House in the next election. But there were basically people that couldn't defend what we'd done. The people that understood what we did and could defend it were reelected.
I believe we have another question over in this part of the room. If there's a microphone, there it is, on its way.
Good morning. My name is Rishi. I'm from Florida. As Senator Gramm mentioned, Social Security is losing money, and this pay-go system that we currently have doesn't seem to be sustainable for the long run because the disbursements are beginning to get greater than the amount that's being taken in. However, privatization of Social Security is politically unpopular. So my question is, what would be an alternative solution so that Social Security remains as a program, or at least some form of income supplement for seniors, while at the same time not kicking the can down the road and bankrupting the trust fund for future generations?
I don't know if anyone has a plan. I've been wondering about the answer to that question too. What's the best reform plan, Mr. Stockman?
I think the best plan is to point out the fact that no one has earned those benefits on a present value financial basis. All right, the formulas in Social Security, including the indexing of your wages over your working lifetime, result in the fact that people get 2 times to 5 times more back from Social Security and Medicare combined than they paid in on a present value basis, same kind of dollars. So given that, and given the demographics, there were 17 million, in 2015, there were 17 million baby boomers over 65. Before long, there'll be 80 million over 65, and by 2040, there'll be 100 million retirees in America, all feeding off that Social Security system. So you have to means test it. Now, the only candidate in this race who even raised the topic was Nikki Haley, and she's done. But her plan was to basically raise the retirement age 25 years from now, in 2050. Right. Well, we'll be long bankrupt or in crisis before then. So you're going to have to means test Social Security if you're going to keep the system alive.
Chris, I'm sure you've thought about, oh, sorry, Senator.
Yeah, I was just going to add, my mama, when we were debating Social Security, called me and said, I just want what I put in and what my employer put in, and just give me that money, and then the whole government can go to hell. And so I got somebody to contact the Social Security Administration to pull her file. And she had, sure enough, as she claimed, paid the maximum in many years. But she was drawing more in 11 months than she and her employer ever put into the system. I think there is a solution to the system. I think we've got to first go to a consumer price index that is the most efficient and accurate measure. We have 5 indices that index government. The one that is the most efficient, as you would guess, indexes the tax code. If we simply took that index and indexed all means-tested programs, we would save over $1 trillion over 10 years. We're going to have to raise the retirement age. Now, how quickly we do it, how dramatically we do it, the bottom line is people are living longer and they'll live happier if they work. I work because I have a young wife who wants money and would put me in a cheap nursing home. we need to raise the retirement age, and we need to raise the minimum retirement age as well, which we didn't do last time, which was a mistake. And then we've got to make some tough choices. But I think those two things are clearly an important part of it. And we've got to address this means-tested explosion in government spending. And if we had a work requirement, more of those people would be working, they would be paying taxes. And, if you wanted to make it easier to reform welfare, give the money to the Social Security Administration. Now, is that real? No, it's phony, but it would be very helpful politically.
Chris, any thoughts on that?
I very much like Phil Gramm's proposals for tweaking things, especially changing the inflation adjustment, and those things could make a substantial difference. The argument that Dave Stockman presents for reforming Social Security is, to my mind, the reason why it's so hard to reform, which is that people are receiving enormous amounts of money. And we have a political system where the government gives out much more money every year than it collects in taxes. And there's political magic in this. And politicians of both parties, citizens of all groups, have gotten used to this. The idea that the government should actually collect taxes to pay for the welfare state, nobody understands this. I think that Paul Ryan will have some additional ideas, such as those that we have heard. And I think we should keep plugging away at them. But I'm impressed that kind of smart, earnest proposals that Speaker Ryan put forward, that President W. Bush put forward, have failed over and over again. It's the Greenspan Commission that David was part of is the last time we made any of those changes. And that those changes would have been much less painful 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. They're getting to be, if you look at what's happening to the Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare, they're roaring at us pretty fast. So I would say that the day that the Treasury Department has to make a choice between sending out checks to Social Security annuitants and bondholders, that's when we're going to get serious.
Okay, I guess that brings us to Jim.
For perspective, I would say that the state of our fiscal affairs is not unlike the state at certain moments in which we would look back and say, that was the meridian of orthodoxy and sound thinking. There was an English politician named Cole, C-O-L-E, who edited, when he wasn't making laws, he edited the Edinburgh Review, which was one of the great Whig journals. And in the year 1912, this man, Cole, wrote something in his journal about this. He said, has the state of our politics come to this, buying votes with the money or the credit of a nation? This was when the British pound was convertible without question into its gold equivalent, and when the world had not yet heard of World War I, that was 2 years later, and when, in retrospect, all was well. It was indeed morning in the world. In 1795, Hamilton himself wrote something about that overborrowing is the disease, all caps, D-I-S-E-A-S-E, all caps, of governments generally. So by way of forestalling despair among the younger people, it's always like this. The difference now is there are more commas, more zeros.
Okay, well, that seems like a hopeful note to end on. So this too shall pass. Let's hope. Thanks,
Yes.
thanks, gentlemen, for your